Well, hello, and welcome back to the second episode of Cyber Voices, the official podcast of the Australian Information Security Association, but you might know us as ASA. I'm your host, David Willett, and it is my pleasure to be sharing the diverse voices of the Australian cyber industry with you. Today, I'm joined all the way from Tasmania by Oliver Smith. Oliver is a lead cyber intelligence analyst for CyberCX, and his team was recently involved with publishing some fascinating research on an AI threat actor on social media called Green Cicada. Oliver has had an incredible career starting in law enforcement before moving into cyber threat intelligence. I really enjoyed getting to spend some time with him and hearing all about the fantastic work done by him and his team. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy Cyber Voices. Now, Oliver, you have got a really fabulous and diverse background, having previously worked as a detective investigating cybercrime for the Tasmanian Police. How did cyber threat intelligence become the thing that Oliver Smith wants to do?
Absolutely. So I started out training to become a lawyer originally. I studied law in Sydney before I moved to Tasmania. And I moved and joined Tasmania Police with the idea that I would become a prosecutor. That was the kind of intended career path that I had when I first joined up. But I very quickly found that I loved the active elements of police work, investigation, producing intelligence, the sort of more hands-on aspects of that, and the ability to have a really, really strong influence on outcomes. I think there would have been a difficulty if I'd become a prosecutor, that you're always pretty far detached from the day-to-day, the sort of the events themselves, sometimes by years even. And that frustration of kind of potentially inheriting someone else's work and having some difficulties with it, that was something that very quickly became apparent to me that I would struggle with. So I fell into investigating pretty quickly. One of the luxuries of a small police agency is that there's a few less people in some of those investigative roles, and there's opportunities to specialize really quickly. You get some opportunities to do very, very interesting work comparatively junior in your career relative to the bigger police agencies. So that was something that I really benefited from, fell into investigative work pretty quickly, and then spent the last 2 years of my policing career in the cybercrime division. The name of that changed a couple of times, but for the majority of my time there, I was on the Joint Anti-Child Exploitation Team, which is a task force that the AFP runs with each of the state police agencies, where there's some pooling of resources and co-location of investigators. When I made my exit from the police, I joined CyberCX as an analyst at that point. So that was a sort of formal transition into cyber threat intelligence. But I'm someone who sees cyber threat intelligence and in general like sub-disciplines within cybersecurity as probably being like a little bit more mixed than a lot of people see them. Like, I think there's quite a bit of bleed through in the skill sets, the attributes that make people really successful in incident response and cyber intelligence. I think they're very, very closely related, and the same through to sort of red teaming, penetration testing. I think it's like a very consolidated skill set that we sometimes project a lot of differentiation on with the way that we think about it. And so I got the fantastic opportunity to come into the cyber intel team at CyberCX when it was very, very small. It's, I think, about 10 times bigger now than it was when I first joined. So like really significant growth. And I just really fell in love with the additional complexity and the ability to kind of really develop a very deep skill set where you have, I guess the way I'd describe it is it's like very similar to police work in that you have a really broad way of a really broad toolbox that you can apply to different problems. And then like that's in general, police have that in terms of investigation. There's like a real latitude in what you can do, how you can approach different problems. That's just compounded as you go into cyber. I think there's just such a diverse, different ways that you can solve and approach problems. And so you can build up a real skill set that is very, very unique. And that's something that's really, I think, really attractive to someone who wants to continually develop their skills and sort of be in a really high skill cap profession. I think cyber intelligence is fantastic on that basis.
Yeah, and you've hit on something that I think has been really important to me in bringing guests onto this podcast, and that is just the diversity of options that are actually available in this industry. Something that you have been quite involved with at CyberCX recently now, and this is one of the reasons why we started having a conversation, Oliver, is people are probably familiar with the research that CyberCX put out recently around a particular AI threat group you've named Green Cicada. Can you describe exactly what Green Cicada is and how you discovered it?
So what the Green Cicada network is, it's a network of at least 5,000 inauthentic accounts that were operating on X, formerly Twitter. And the interesting aspects about the network of inauthentic accounts is that we had some very strong indications that the network was controlled in concert by some sort of large language model-based AI system, and it was producing political content that was primarily focused on the US, but we saw some political content across basically all geographies, including some content relevant to Australia. We don't have any very strong attribution in terms of who was the individual in control of this network, but there are some very strong connections to China, such as the promotion of material published by an AI researcher from Tsinghua University and Jifu AI, and the promotion of models produced by the knowledge engineering group at Tsinghua University, and also a very strong Chinese language bias in both the prompts and the model that we were able to identify, including fluctuations from English into Chinese during partway through outputs from the LLM-based system, and also some pretty strong evidence that the prompts were originally made in the Chinese language with explicit instructions to provide responses in English. So there are some pretty significant question marks about the nature of the network. One of the really distinctive things to us about it, the very, very high occurrence of mistakes, that is sort of malformed outputs from the network, that allowed us to piece together quite a lot of detail about the way that the underlying controlling system functions. And so those types of mistakes were things like the accounts that the LLM was producing content for identifying as AI language models. So that's kind of a classic mistake that we might see in what's called a refusal from a large language model. If you were to ask like a model like ChatGPT to do something that is a contravention of its safety training, something like producing a bomb, very typically its response to you would be, as an language model, I'm unable to provide information. And it will continue with some sort of explanation on that basis of why it's unable to provide that information. That pattern is very, very strong in a lot of the large language models that are out there in the wild, because there's a sort of convergence of training data and a lot of use of synthetic data, where patterns like that have become basically ubiquitous across all language models that are out there and available at the moment.
For those of us out there who are not that clued into how cyber threat intelligence works or what people like yourselves and your team might be doing, what was the first indication of what you might be looking at?
So how this came about, I was monitoring the incidence of the phrase as an AI language model in tweets that were being posted on X through the course of 2024.
Yep.
And in late May, so in a 3-day period between the 29th and the 31st of May this year, there was a big spike in the incidence of that phrase. And it's, I guess, important for me to emphasize that phrase is sometimes used as a joke. I think it's like a relatively common joke in today's era on social media that if you're interacting with a bot, people might say that and it's incidental. But the big spike that we saw in late May, they were very consistent, and a lot of the accounts had some very similar attributes in terms of the formation of the accounts. So it's things like their profile pictures having some very distinctive markers of having been AI generated faces, and then when the accounts were created, and then patterns in who the accounts were interacting with and promoting, that really started to move us towards the analysis that these accounts were a consistent network. That is, this wasn't the incidental kind of failure of it was a group of 72 accounts that were that inciting incident. It wasn't the incidental failure of 72 large language model-based Twitter profiles, where we were seeing a glimpse there of an underlying system that was behaving in concert, and it was a single cluster. And from that point, we did some analysis on what the outbound activity was from that set of accounts. So when those accounts were promoting content or interacting with people, who was it or what was it that they were interacting with? And there was a very significant anomaly in terms of the center of the network. So a high proportion of those accounts interacted with a relatively sparsely interacted with AI researcher from Tsinghua University. And in general, those accounts are interacting with very commonly trending profiles, people like Elon Musk on Twitter. But there was this very significant anomaly in terms of the cluster having very early in the account's life cycles, having promoted content from this AI researcher. And it was anomalous in terms of the type of content that it was as well. They didn't typically engage with academic research. So it really stuck out in terms of it does look like there's some distinctive activity here. This is anomalous in terms of the nature of the engagement. And we're able to then use that as a bit of a pivot to analyze the other accounts that were interacting with that AI researcher's content. And we identified that those accounts were very similarly composed inauthentic accounts. So again, the distribution of the accounts creation times were very, very similar to the initial AI accounts. We saw some different markers of failed or malformed outputs that were consistent with AI generated content from those accounts. And they also contained AI generated profile pictures. So one of the ways that we're able to identify that is that the placement of the pupils in the profile pictures was identical throughout all of the profile pictures, which is an artifact of some generative AI systems that have been around for a little while and were trained on data sets where all of the faces that they consumed as their training data had been normalized to have the pupils in the same place. So all of the outputs that they produce have that characteristic as well. And people might be familiar with a tool called This Person Does Not Exist, where you can go and just pull up a randomly generated fake face that reads very, very true to life. It's plausible that was the type of tool that was used to produce all of these profile pictures.
And this was really sort of something that you came across as doing almost a bit of personal research, right? So you were looking for that particular string of words. Was there anything in particular that you were actually looking for at that time, or was that just something that you were doing in terms of you were following a particular lead and the mistake happened in this network or pretty much right at the time you were looking? Is that kind of how it played out?
Oh, it was a phenomenon that I've been tracking for a little while.
Okay,
Just because I was keeping a little bit of an eye on it. I had the idea that I would basically write up some research in a personal capacity, tracing through. Like I had a pretty strong suspicion that people were operating networks of accounts that were controlled in a very similar way. I guess what I didn't expect, or what made this noteworthy, is the scale of this network. The fact that there's a lot of production of politically charged material, divisive material, so it was sort of less in that space of potentially being sort of inauthentic content promotion and much more towards that space of an information operation capability, creating political division, degrading the discourse. In that space, it's a much more sinister type of objective that you might use this type of system for. So it jumped out at me for that reason.
Are you continuing to monitor the network? Is it still active?
So the network is not still active, at least in the form that we tracked as Green Cicada. So following the release of our research, we saw a very quick systematic disruption of the network accounts by someone at X.
Yeah.
I can't say for sure that that's as the result of our research, but the timing lines up that potentially it is. And basically to an account within the 2 weeks following our publication, the entire network had been taken down. We also saw the closure of the AI researcher that the accounts were centered around. We saw the closure of their accounts by them rather than being taken down by Twitter. That account was closed and deleted by that individual. So I think a detail that's really important to tease out here is that we saw the periodic improvement of the network's capabilities. So there was some very clear episodes of consistent mistakes being made, very similar to the mistake that first identified the network to us in May. Yeah. There were other very similar mistakes. So things like the tweets produced by the network being wrapped in 3 backticks or being prefaced by comment and then colon. So just little artifacts that were the model just failing to abide with some instruction from its operator, and producing just like a little bit of distinctive additional content that we could identify across many network outputs in the same time period. And then, so those mistakes would occur on a really consistent basis, and then they would be eliminated. And that suggests that someone was actively developing the network. They were watching out for these mistakes. So there was, I've sort of mentioned already that there was a distinctive carelessness that was attached to the operation of this network. That wasn't a complete abandonment of the capability. There was absolutely someone watching these outputs, monitoring the network and improving those mistakes over time. Mm-hmm. It's really important to emphasize here that those improvements, they will persist into the future. Mm-hmm. Someone has a code base sitting out there that they were using to power this network. And while the accounts themselves might have been disrupted, that capability still exists. And it's very likely that it could be spun up again by the same threat actor.
The other question I guess I wanted to ask you then was, how do you feel that artificial intelligence is changing the threat landscape, and what does that mean? What does that mean for everyone?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the critical questions for us at the moment, because it's one of the biggest technological shifts that we've kind of seen in the modern era, or it has the potential to be. As far as the specific impact on us as cyber practitioners, my assessment is that current generation language models are going to be most effective in the space that we're talking about here, the information operation space, and then the social engineering space. And the reason for that, like there's a few factors that kind of influence those as being the most desirable places to leverage AI capabilities in cyber. So a couple of those things are that current generation AI is not really good at solving novel cyber problems. Like if you take for example, vulnerability research and exploit development, that's often really, really contextual, very, very widely contextual, relies on analyzing many different files that dictate system functionality. That AI is not very good at consuming those kind of disparate signals that make a really good vulnerability researcher. And so we don't really see people building systems that are capable of autonomously exploiting vulnerabilities. And the other factor that's really important to keep in mind is that if you were to develop an exploit, for example, it's already trivial in general to exploit every vulnerable device in the world, right? You can just sort of add a little bit of, spend an extra half an hour on your script to make it just be iterating over every IP address in the world. So that type of scale is already really cheap in cyber, because when we're talking about purely in the really technical realm, you can already automate things. It's already like relatively trivial. So where we think AI is most likely to be really valuable is when that type of automation capability doesn't already exist. So things like the generation of social engineering content, the generation of sort of human dialogue. So using generative AI models to support things like a phishing engagement with an individual or something like an investment scam, pig butchering scam, they're fantastic uses of the tech, because the core strength of generative AI at the moment is mimicking normal human dialogue. Right, their capabilities are just not sharp enough to do novel things in cyber. It's also worth us kind of, I guess, worth mentioning that there's a real chance that we're reaching a bit of a point of diminishing returns in the development of LLM's capabilities. There's some pretty strong indications that there's convergence around the top end of capability from different providers, and open source is getting closer and closer to the sharpest proprietary models from organizations like OpenAI. And that's really important for us to consider, because it means there's a chance that the status quo is going to stick where it is at the moment for a little while. It's often felt like it's almost futile effort to be getting too deep into trying to analyze the risk that's posed by AI, because it's been moving so quickly. I think there's a real chance that we're entering a period now where things will slow right down, and we will exist in the current state of capability until there's a shift in hardware or software paradigm that starts off a new kind of bull run of AI.
We talk a lot about its powers for evil. Are you seeing, especially in your line of work, AI starting to be used to be able to enhance the work that we do in the cyber realm, especially when it comes to threat intelligence and threat hunting? I mean, the answer could be no, but I mean, or even if you see some applications or use cases for good, because there is some great potential with AI.
Yeah, absolutely, there is some potential for good. On the whole, my view is that there's a bit of an asymmetry that favors adversaries at the moment, or like favors people on the attacking side, and that's basically because they have a really high tolerance for failures, where that doesn't really apply to people on the defensive side. So if you think about a system that produces like half of what it produces is very, very ineffective, someone on the adversary side might be happy with that, because they're just going to run a lot of attacks, and they can live with that scale. It's still a valuable capability to them. If you have some sort of defensive system that has a 50% failure rate, that's just completely unconscionable for most of the systems that we're analyzing here. So there is a bit of an asymmetry there in terms of tolerance for bad outputs. There are sort of smaller spaces within defensive or intelligence analysis where we can make really great use of recently emerged capabilities. One of the things that we did for the narrative analysis element of our green cicada research was to represent all of the outputs from the network on a graph. That was it was a spatial representation of the semantic differences between the outputs. So something like the sky is blue and the sky is light blue today. They're two sentences that have a really, really close meaning. When we display those graphically, they'd be really, really close on that graph. That allowed us to identify things that were really, really close in meaning, but not identical. And that meant that we could identify episodes where the network was behaving in a really consistent way, slight variations of the same message being posted by many, many accounts. And that was how we identified some of the campaign narratives that were being pushed through the network. So it was a glimpse at what the operator's objectives might have been. And that's a really powerful capability that relies on something called text embedding models that are part of the sort of transform away of the current generation of AI. And that's something that we couldn't have done to analyze this type of network a few years ago. So it's a really powerful capability. But in my view, on the defender side, we need to be looking at like really, really small problems to be solving. And sometimes those problems can be really, really hard to find.
I'm always interested in knowing how these things get named. Green cicada. What was the? And I'm sure it will be very obvious to me once you tell me. But where did the name come from?
So our paradigm with naming threat actors is that we don't sort of encode the attribution of country into the threat actor's name. So we're trying to come up with a name that has some sort of, it evokes some aspect of the threat actor. Mm-hmm. And in relation to the Green Cicada network, like some of the aspects about that, one detail that we haven't spoken to that played into the name was that the vast majority of the network's accounts were dormant. So they weren't actively participating in political discourse on Twitter. They were potentially being used to boost other accounts' content, but they were just sitting there dormant. And that was that was the vast majority of the network. And so in terms of the timing of when accounts were created versus when they became active, if those dormant accounts had followed the same pattern, they would have become active around now, so in the immediate lead up to the US election. And so that was part of our naming. One of the features that played into the name there is a lot of this network was waiting underground and waiting to come out in concert and make a lot of noise, just like cicadas do. So that's the core of the name. There are a few other little aspects that went into it, but the reason that we don't encode the country's name into our threat actors, something like people might be familiar with threat actors tracked as things like Volt Typhoon or like Mustang Panda, where those animal names or that weather event name that relates to a particular country, China in both cases there. The reason that we don't do that is because if you ever get that attribution wrong, then it's really difficult to change a threat actor's name post facto. So we'll try to stick into just evoking some nature of the threat actor in the way that we name them.
Yeah. Oliver, you and your team are doing such fabulous work. And there is always more to be done in this space, and we need so many more people doing the kind of work that you do. There is, a lot of people that we've got coming on the show at the moment really focused on the cyber skills gap. One question I would like to ask you that's adjacent to that is, as someone who is leading such a fabulous career in cyber threat intelligence, is there any advice that you would have to anyone out there who is wanting to dive into this very complex but rewarding world?
Absolutely. I think cyber threat intelligence is a fantastic place for a lot of people with diverse skill sets to kind of make an entry into cyber. I'd say the majority of our team has entered from an investigative or intelligence background, which is really fantastic. It means that people can kind of broach a skill set where you are very analytical, you think in a very structured way, you can produce data that's very, very justifiable in order to power the assessment that you're making and justify them to decision makers. That type of skill set marries really, really well with cyber threat intelligence, and it's a fantastic way to kind of make that entry into the field and then bring up those technical skills, that technical comprehension. So yeah, I think it's a fantastic field in terms of making that entry into cyber from a different analytical role. We really value that, like diversity of thought, diversity of opinion. The contestation that goes on within our team is what allows us to produce what I hope is sharp research that helps people to understand what the threat landscape looks like.
That's incredible. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Oliver, and thank you for sharing your voice with us.
I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks for having me.
Thank you once again for listening to another episode of Cyber Voices. Our music is by Sanar Garut, and our show artwork is by Studio Quarantine. Please follow the show on your podcast platform of choice and leave us a 5-star review. It does help others find the show. Also, please make sure you follow the association on LinkedIn or Instagram. If you want to add your voice to our ever-growing chorus of diverse cyber voices, if you have questions or even some feedback on the show, or perhaps would like to be a sponsor, you can do so by emailing us at cybervoices@asa.org.au. Are you an ASA member? If not, you should consider joining our network of over 12,000 plus cybersecurity professionals across Australia. An ASA membership can open doors, build professional networks, create lifetime friendships, and offer exclusive training, events, and other perks. Become a member today by heading to our website at asa.org.au. That's all for today. I hope you will join us again next time on Cyber Voices.